Welcome to Saving America. This is your host, Dr. David D. Shine, for a segment that we call Just the Facts. And I've got a special report. We don't have a live guest, but I'm condensing an article that I thought was very worthwhile. It was based on a presentation by John R. Lott at Hillsdale College, a conservative college up in the central United States. Lott is the founder and president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's got a very distinguished background that includes teaching positions at U Chicago, Wharton School of Penn, where I went, Stanford University, Yale, and Rice University here in Houston. He also served in the Trump administration as a senior advisor for research and statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice. And he studied voter fraud, how appropriate. And he's the author of 10 books, including More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws, which sounds like a fascinating topic for a future Just the Facts segment. But in any event, what he's talking about is the importance of election integrity to a democracy. And I certainly overwhelmingly agree with him, and just wanted to present some high points from his Hillsdale presentation. So he notes the following: in 2005, the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform issued a report that proposed a uniform system of requiring a photo ID in order to vote in US elections. Now, this also pointed out widespread absentee voting makes vote fraud more likely. Voter files contain ineligible, duplicate, fictional, and deceased voters, a fact easily exploited using absentee ballots to commit fraud. Citizens who vote absentee are more susceptible further to pressure and intimidation. Vote buying schemes are also easier with absentee ballots. Who is behind the Carter-Baker Commission? The commission's two ranking members were the former Democrat president, Jimmy the Failure Carter, and James Baker, former Secretary of State, a Republican. Now, the Democrats on that commission were Majority Leader Tom Daschle, certainly no conservative, and former Indiana Congressman Lee Hamilton. It was truly a bipartisan commission, dedicated to trying to get a fair vote, whoever wins, which is the way the elections ought to be run in this country. And despite the survey showing that Americans overwhelmingly support measures to ensure election integrity, a recent Rasmussen study found that 80% of Americans, and that is across all racial groups, support a voter ID requirement. Democrat leaders across the board are opposed to this. Why, folks? Why would you be opposed to having honest, careful elections, other than the fact that you plan to commit fraud and you don't want to be interfered with while you're defrauding the American public? Yeah, folks, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but think about it. 80% of the American public favor voter ID laws because they understand the importance of the vote. And by the way, that includes African-American voters. So let's stop fooling around with things here. In the meantime, that moron, Joe Biden, makes a speech criticizing the proposal to have more conservative voting rules and limiting absentee ballots. And it's so ludicrous. He calls it a reference back to slavery, a reference back to Jim Crow. Joe, shut up. Go hide in a basement somewhere where you hid all during the last election, and let the adults take over. You're done. And by the way, it's kind of interesting. Biden at 79 had his annual physical recently. He had a colonoscopy, and I guess they were looking for his brains down there because apparently they didn't do a mental acuity check as part of his physical. Yeah. But in any event, he'll shoot his mouth off about any topic that he thinks appeals to his voter base, and the American people are worse off for it, of course. The fact is, the US is an outlier among the world's democracies in not requiring voter ID. Of the 47 countries in Europe today, 46 of them currently require government-issued IDs to vote. The British Parliament is the exception. They are considering it now. When it comes to absentee voting, Americans, accustomed as we are to loose rules, are often shocked to learn that 35 of 47 European countries don't allow absentee voting. Another 10 European countries allow absentee voting, but require the voters to show up in person to pick up the ballots. And how about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico? Canada requires a photo ID to vote. Voter shows up at the polls without a voter ID, he has to prove who he is. If there's someone working at the polling station, you can personally verify who he is. That's pretty interesting. Mexico, of course, has had a long history of election fraud. The United States is probably getting right down there with Mexico based on what we've seen lately. But its leaders are concerned about the drop in foreign investment if it was continued to be perceived as the wacko corrupt operation that it appears to be. To prove it's a legitimate democracy, Mexico recently instituted strict reforms. Voters must present a biometric ID, an ID with not only a photo, but also a thumbprint. That's Mexico, folks. That's not the United States. That doesn't sound like slavery to me. It doesn't sound like Jim Crow to me. Those who oppose election integrity reform here in the US often condemn it as a means of voter suppression. But in Mexico, the percent of people voting went up from 59% to 68% after they put in these reforms. Further, Mexico does not permit absentee ballots. All of those who are opposing these common sense measures to secure our election integrity, such as the measures of the Carter-Baker Commission, they're not motivated by democracy. Let's all stop allowing them to put that kind of nonsense out there. What they're doing is taking advantage of the situation and purely in a power grab. And if we make it harder for them to steal power, they get upset. Gee, isn't that too bad? And this is Just the Facts for Saving America by your host, Dr. David D. Shine. Thanks for joining us.